These three disturbing winter horror stories are inspired by real events. First, a killer on a frozen lake. He fooled the police, but the smart watch in his pocket tracked every step of the murder. Next, a girl vanishes. Her tracks stop dead in an open field, proving she wasn't taken by the woods. Some think she was snatched straight up into the sky. Finally, a frozen figure stalks a store clerk. It stands in the lot, pointing a blue finger toward a grave buried under 3 years of snow. Stick around for that last one. You won't believe what was in the woods. Winter air on Lake Mille Lacs cuts right through the Carhartts. It finds the skin and bites down hard. January 12, 2018 was one of those nights where the mercury buried itself at 15 below. Out on the mudflats, 4 miles from shore, the ice looked like an endless sheet of white concrete. Inside the shack, it was warm. Propane heat kept the cold at bay. 2 men sat at the small table, thick as thieves. Hunter and Luke, best friends since grade school. You saw one, you saw the other. This wasn't their first trip to the flats. They came every year, and every year they dealt with the same headache parked 50 yards away. Dale. Dale was a fixture out here, and he was always a problem. Bad blood had been brewing between the shacks for seasons. Last winter, Dale accused Hunter of drilling too close to his setup. The year before that, there was a screaming match over a missing propane tank. It was always something. Dale was the kind of guy who let a grudge rot inside him until it turned sour. He was a ticking clock that never stopped winding. But tonight, inside Luke and Hunter's shack, things seemed fine. Whiskey bottle on the table was half empty. Cards were scattered across the plywood. Hunter was a big guy, athletic, loud when he laughed. Luke was quieter, 26 years old, sharp-eyed. At 8:30 p.m., they posted a video to Snapchat. Just 2 buddies in a fish house, toasting tin cups, grinning like idiots. Digital proof of a good night. Everything seemed perfect. Just 2 guys escaping the grind. But the ice shifts. It cracks. And things out here aren't always what they seem. 50 yards away, Dale's shack sat in the dark. He had been drinking all day. At 10:45 p.m., his voice carried over the frozen silence. "I'll kill you!" It was a jagged scream, raw and angry. Same old Dale, same old threats. Luke opened the door of their shack. He held it wide. He wanted to make sure the wind caught that sound. He wanted to make sure any other fisherman within a mile heard the threat. With their history, nobody would question it. "Hear that?" Luke asked, looking back at Hunter. Hunter just laughed, pouring another round. He wasn't worried. He was used to Dale's noise, and he had his best friend watching his back. Morning came, but the sun didn't bring any warmth. It brought lights, sirens wailing across the ice road. Deputies swarmed the flats. Yellow tape fluttered in the biting wind. The story spread through the local bait shops before noon. A tragedy. A break-in gone wrong. Hunter was dead in his bunk, stabbed. Luke was the survivor. He told the first deputies on the scene that he had woken up to a noise. He saw the door open. He panicked. He scrambled out and ran through the snow to get help, but it was too late. They found a fillet knife in Dale's sled. It had blood on it. Dale was arrested before his hangover even wore off. He sat in the back of a cruiser, confused, shouting that he didn't do it. But nobody listens to the town drunk when there's a dead kid, a bloody knife, and years of bad blood between them. A week passed. The town of Isle mourned. Luke was a rock. He stood by Hunter's family. He sat in the front row at the vigil, head bowed. Hunter's girlfriend, Maya, leaned on him, crying into his heavy winter coat. He held her up. He told stories about their fishing trips. He talked about what a great guy Hunter was. People patted Luke on the back. They called him a good man, a loyal friend who had lived through a nightmare. Everything fit: the angry neighbor, the history of fights, the witness who ran for help. It was an open and shut case. Then the phone rang. January 20th, a detective from the county sheriff's office. He didn't sound angry, he just sounded tired. "Luke, we need you to come down just to close out the file. Sign off on the statement so we can release Hunter to the family." "I'll be right there," Luke said. He drove down to the station, ready to put this whole ugly week behind him. Interrogation room 3 is a small box. Cinder block walls painted a color that used to be beige. No windows, just a metal table bolted to the floor. Luke sat down. He looked tired. Grief does that to a man. Or maybe it was stress. The detective walked in. He was a heavy-set guy, suspenders straining against a blue shirt. He carried a manila folder. He sat down heavily. "We appreciate you coming in," the detective said. "Know it's tough." "Just want it over," Luke said. "Hunter deserves peace." "He does," the detective agreed. He opened the folder. "We pulled the data from Hunter's smartwatch. Just standard procedure. Confirms the time of death. Heart rate stopped at 2:58 a.m. Luke nodded. "That's when I heard the noise. That's when I ran." "Right," the detective said. "You ran to Dale's shack, 50 yards, deep snow, in the dark." "I ran fast," Luke said. "We know you did," the detective said. "Or we know you said you did." He pulled another piece of paper from the folder, a graph with a jagged blue line. "See, Luke, we also pulled the data from your phone. That M-series chip inside, it's a marvel. Tracks everything. Steps, elevation, speed." The air in the room seemed to get heavier. Luke shifted in his chair. "You had your phone in your pocket, right?" "Yeah," Luke said. So, the detective tapped the blue line. "This is a record of your movement. At 2:57 a.m., it shows a vertical drop of 4 feet. That's you getting out of the top bunk." "Okay," Luke said, his voice tight. "Like I said, I heard a noise." "And then," the detective continued, his finger tracing the spikes, "between 2:58 a.m. and 3:05 a.m., the accelerometer recorded exactly 62 steps." The detective looked up. His eyes weren't tired anymore. They were hard. 62 steps, Luke. We measured the shack. We measured the distance to Dale's. If you ran to Dale's shack and back, that phone would have logged over 200 steps. It would have shown speed. It would have shown distance. Luke stopped breathing. The room was silent save for the buzz of the lights. "But it didn't," the detective said. "It showed 62 slow, deliberate steps. Pace, stop, pace, stop. It shows a man walking around a 10-foot room." The best friend mask slipped. Beneath it, there was no grief. There was just calculation. "You never ran for help," the detective said. "You never left the shack. You climbed down. You stood by that bottom bunk. You did what you did. You staged the scene. And then you climbed back up." Luke stared at the graph. He had used Dale's history against him. He had used the threats. He had fooled the town, the girlfriend, the deputies. But he had forgotten the machine in his pocket. "Why?" the detective asked. "Money? A girl? Just sick of him?" Luke didn't answer. He couldn't. The story of the grieving brother, the survivor, the loyal friend, it all shattered under the weight of a jagged blue line. 62 steps, the detective said, closing the folder. "That's a long walk to nowhere." He stood up. The handcuffs came off his belt. Luke stood up too. He turned around. He felt the metal click onto his wrists. He thought about that phone. He had kept it in his pocket to hide the light. to keep the room dark, to keep his secret safe. Instead, it had been counting every move, every lie, every betrayal. Winter on the lake is cold, but it's got nothing on the truth. Brownington? Vermont isn't just rural, it's isolated. Up in Orleans County, they call it the Northeast Kingdom, but locals know it's just the middle of nowhere. It gets dark early there, and the weather doesn't mess around. Back in 2008, winter hit hard when a massive ice storm came through, sealing the ground in a layer of hard, jagged crust before fresh snow fell on top of it, creating a recipe for disaster. Bailey and her cousin Holly were staying at an old farmhouse out there, built in the 1800s at the end of a Class 4 road. For city folks, that classification is a warning. The town doesn't plow it, so if you get stuck, you aren't getting out until spring. That kind of forced isolation meant the girls had to rely on each other. They weren't just cousins. They were raised closer than sisters, sharing a bunk bed and a room since kindergarten because Holly's parents worked long-haul trucking shifts. Holly was the spark plug of the family, loud, artistic, always drawing on her sneakers with a Sharpie, the kind of kid who would try to rescue a stray raccoon because she thought it looked lonely. Communication out there was a joke because both girls had those Motorola Razr flip phones, slim, metallic, but expensive paperweights in a place where no service was the only thing on the screen. The only link to the outside world was a copper wire landline in the kitchen. That night, December 28th, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero, making the house settle and pop as the wood contracted in the freeze, sounding like gunshots when the timber snaps. Around 9 o'clock that night, boredom set in, so Bailey and Holly decided to sneak out to mess around in the snow. It was about 2 feet deep, that deceptive kind with light, powdery dust sitting on top of the rock-hard ice layer from the previous storm. They walked out near the porch. Bailey was 12, steady and cautious, while Holly was 12 but small, maybe 85 pounds soaking wet and full of that nervous energy she always had. They dropped back to make snow angels, arms moving back and forth in just normal kid stuff, laughing about how the cold air burned their lungs. When they stood up to check their work, Bailey's angel looked fine, just a shallow impression in the powder. But when she looked at Holly's, the physics were all wrong. Holly was light and shouldn't have broken through the base layer. Yet her angel was sunk 6 inches deeper than Bailey's, cutting right through the ice crust into the hard earth below with sharp edges. It didn't look like a girl lying down. It looked like the ground had grabbed her by the jacket and yanked her down. Bailey felt sick looking at it. Not scared yet, just off, like seeing a door open when you know you shut it. "Let's go inside," Bailey said. And for the first time in her life, Holly didn't argue or crack a joke. She just went in and locked the door without saying a word. When morning broke at 7 o'clock the next day, the house was freezing. Bailey walked into the mudroom and looked at the mat by the door to see Holly's pink comic boots sitting side by side, perfectly neat. Bailey felt a pit in her stomach because Holly never left anything neat. She was a tornado of energy, not someone who lined up her boots. If the boots were here, where was she? Bailey looked at the side door, which was unlatched and drifting open just an inch with the wind whistling through the crack. She pushed the door open to look at the porch steps and saw tracks, but not boot prints. They were sock prints. Now, here is the thing about extreme cold. When it's 10 below zero and you step outside in wool socks, your body heat melts the top layer of snow for a split second before the air freezes it back instantly, creating a hard, perfect ice cast of the foot where you can see the texture of the wool. Holly had walked out there in her socks. Bailey stepped onto the porch and followed the line of casts with her eyes, counting 1 step, then 2, until they went 15 feet past the porch out into the open yard and just stopped. Tracks don't just stop. That's not how the world works. But these did. Bailey walked to the edge of the porch and stared at that last footprint, looking for turnaround marks. But the snow wasn't trampled. There were no jump marks either. No deep landing divot, just pristine, flat, unbroken white beyond that last footprint, like she had been unzipped from reality. Inside, the panic started. Bailey's parents grabbed the landline to dial 911, routing them to the Vermont State Police since rural Orleans County doesn't have local cops. You have to wait for troopers to drive up from the barracks in Darby, a 40-minute haul while the wind picked up and a nor'easter started blowing in. Trooper Denver arrived first, frowning when he saw the boots and the tracks, because he knew what 10 below zero did to a kid in socks. He brought a K9 unit, a tracking dog that usually doesn't fail, but physics was working against them since scent molecules freeze and drop in sub-zero temps with heavy snow. Denver led the dog to the last ice cast and gave the command to track, but after 1 sniff, the dog started spinning in frantic, tight circles. It began making a high-pitched whine and wouldn't go forward or even look at the woods, just tucking its tail to back away toward the cruiser, because animal instinct told it something was wrong. Denver put the dog away and pulled out a mag light with a heavy-duty beam to cut through the falling snow, sweeping the light toward the tree line until a trooper spotted a 3rd indentation. It was too far out to reach without ruining the snow evidence, so they took pictures showing a depression in the snow 7 feet long. There were no footprints leading to it, no drag marks, and no tracks leading away. Just a heavy impact crater in the middle of a pristine field that was physically impossible unless the object that made it had been dropped from the sky. It wasn't until January 1st, 2023, that Bailey finally went back to the property. She's 27 now, living a few towns over, but she hadn't set foot on that land since the day the police tape came down. Her family broke apart after that winter. Her uncle drank himself into an early grave searching those woods, and her aunt stopped speaking entirely, just sitting in a chair staring at the driveway waiting for a kid who wasn't coming back. They abandoned the farmhouse right after the investigation dried up, leaving Holly's drawings on the fridge and the dishes in the sink because nobody could stomach packing up a life that ended so abruptly. Bailey spent her 20s driving 10 miles out of her way just to avoid the turnoff, terrified that seeing the roofline would drag her right back to that frozen morning. But she finally had to meet an appraiser there to put the place on the market. She walked the rooms with her iPhone to document the damage for the bank, using modern stabilization software that makes everything look unnatural. She cleared the kitchen and stopped at the window, looking out at the yard that was fully fenced now with flat snow untouched by the wind. She aimed the lens through the glass, tapping the screen to focus, and that's when the autofocus box jittered and locked onto the middle of the yard. Bailey lowered the phone and squinted through the dirty glass because her brain couldn't make the math work. There were marks in the snow, 3 faint, shallow depressions, and she stared at them, trying to find a logical explanation. It wasn't possible for snow to survive 14 summers. The grass had grown, died, and rotted back into the earth a dozen times over, and rain should have washed the yard flat years ago. Seeing those shapes there, perfectly preserved, felt like a glitch in reality, something that defied every law of science she knew. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it had to be a reflection or a smudge on the glass, but the marks didn't move. Then she saw the 4th one right next to the old scars, and that's when the real shock hit. It was a fresh one, crisp, deep, with sharp edges like it had been cut 10 minutes ago, a perfect angel shape no more than 4 feet tall, exactly the size Holly was the day she vanished. Bailey didn't shake or run. She just felt the air leave the room as her logic broke entirely. She hit the shutter button to take a live photo. That night, she sat in her truck and opened the file, watching the timestamp jump and roll over like a broken odometer. She pressed her thumb on the glass to activate the motion, hearing static fill the audio before seeing the movement. In the corner of the frame, a blur of white didn't fall down. It launched upward, accelerating straight into the granite gray sky before the screen cut to black. The family had spent years afraid of the woods, convinced the forest took her. But Bailey realized they had been looking down when they should have been looking up. Halloween night, 1991, buried Duluth under 37 inches of concrete heavy snow. It wasn't just a storm, it was a burial. High on the ridge at Market and Main, Bruce stood by the break room window, watching the city disappear behind a curtain of ice that moved sideways. Winds hit 45 miles per hour. The parking lot turned into a blind wasteland. Landmarks vanished. Emergency sirens went silent. Heavy machinery ruled the dark. Giant caterpillar loaders moved through the whiteout like prehistoric beasts, their engines roaring as they fought to keep the ridge from being swallowed whole. Bruce watched the strobe lights of a loader near the back ravine. The driver was fighting the blind spots, pushing forward on instinct. A massive steel blade hit a heavy pile near the drop-off. Metal scraped against asphalt, making a harsh, grinding noise. The loader shoved the entire mass over the edge, sending tons of snow crashing into the black woods below. Bruce watched the pile vanish into the abyss. He nodded to himself, impressed by the driver's efficiency, and turned back to his coffee. 3 years ground by like a rusted gear. Seasons bled into one another. The whiteout of 91 melted into gray slush, then dried into cracked summer asphalt. Bruce worked the closing shifts, a rhythm that numbed the mind. Count the till, mop the floors, lock the heavy steel doors. Life moved on, but the nights at the ridge felt different. Sometimes, dragging trash bags to the dumpsters, Bruce would stop near the edge of the ravine. The woods down there were thick, tangled with shadow. He'd get a feeling like static in his teeth, a sudden, sharp instinct that the silence down there wasn't empty. He'd stare into the black, waiting for a sound that never came, then shake it off, light a cigarette, and go home to sleep without dreaming. January 1994 brought the debt due. It brought no fresh snow, just a temperature of 20 below, and a wind that felt like a razor against the skin. Bruce clocked out at 11:34 p.m. Silence in the lot was heavy, pressing down on his ears. His boots crunched on a sheet of black ice that coated the asphalt like glass. The lot was empty. It should have been empty, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up, stiff and painful. Someone was watching. He reached his Chevy Caprice, his breath puffing out in short, nervous bursts. He grabbed his plastic scraper and attacked the windshield. He scraped the plastic blade against the glass, creating a loud, grating noise in the dead air. He stopped, his hand freezing mid-motion. The feeling of eyes on him was a physical weight. He slowly turned his head toward the far edge of the lot. A figure stood on top of a 10-foot snowbank. Bruce narrowed his eyes. The man was perfectly still, a statue carved out of the night. He wore a denim jacket and high-top sneakers. Clothes meant for a summer concert, not a Duluth winter. No hat, no gloves. The wind was howling now, tearing at Bruce's scarf, but the figure's long blonde hair hung perfectly straight. It didn't move, not a strand. "Store's closed!" Bruce yelled, his voice cracked. The figure didn't flinch, it didn't blink. It just stood there like a jagged piece of the landscape that didn't belong. A profound wrongness settled in Bruce's chest. This wasn't a drunk. This wasn't a kid pulling a prank. This was something else. Bruce scrambled into his car, the door slamming with a hollow noise. He turned the key, praying the engine would catch in the freeze. It roared to life. Tires spun on the ice, whining high and desperate, before gripping. He sped away, checking his rearview mirror until the lot disappeared, fleeing that unmoving, silent stare. 2 nights later, the silence turned into a hunt. Bruce was checking the back perimeter, the area near the rusted dumpsters where the shadows were deepest. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping over the brick walls. The beam hit the gap between 2 bins. A silhouette was standing there, tall, rigid. Bruce swung the light back. The space was empty. It hadn't vanished, it had stepped back. It moved with deliberate, intelligent intent. This wasn't a vagrant looking for warmth. It was something that understood how to hide. Bruce backed away, keeping the light trained on the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He got inside and locked the door. The next morning, he found the proof in the fresh powder. Footprints circled his Chevy Caprice. 3 times. Perfect, obsessive loops. The tracks weren't erratic. They were measured. They stopped at the driver's side window. The snow there was packed down hard, compressed from hours of standing in one spot. Someone had been standing inches from his glass, watching his empty seat while he was inside working. Watching, waiting. Friday hit. A new blizzard slammed the city, a twin to the '91 storm. Power lines snapped somewhere down the block. The lights at Market and Main died instantly, plunging the ridge into a tomb-like dark. Bruce didn't wait to check the breakers. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, a sound that drilled into his skull. He ran for his car, head down, fighting the gale. He fumbled with his keys, the metal biting into his frozen fingers. He dropped them. They hit the ice with a sharp metallic ring. Panic flared in his gut. He fell to his knees, scrabbling on the ice, blind in the dark. His fingers brushed the keys. He snatched them up, unlocked the door, and threw himself into the driver's seat. He slammed the lock down. It engaged with a sharp snap. Safe. He was safe. He let out a shaky breath and turned to look out the driver's window. A face was inches from his own. Pressed against the glass. No fog. No breath. Just skin the color of a bruised plum, waxy and tight against the bone. Ice crystals were frozen into the eyelashes. The eyes were wide, blue, and vacant. Dead eyes. Bruce screamed. He scrambled backward, jamming his back against the passenger door, but there was nowhere to go. No sound came from the other side of the glass. There was no banging, no desperate scratching to get in, just that heavy, dead stare. The boy outside didn't look angry. He looked patient. Slowly, terrifyingly, the boy raised a hand. The movement was stiff, like a rusted hinge forcing open. The frozen finger pointed. It didn't point at Bruce. It pointed past the car, toward the back of the property, toward the steep, wooded ravine where the snow was dumped. It was a command. Bruce didn't look where the finger was pointing. He jammed the car into gear and peeled out, his hands shaking so hard he could barely steer. He drove straight to the precinct, almost wrecking twice on the ice. He didn't make sense when he got there, blabbering about a frozen kid and a blue face. But the fear on his face was enough to get them moving. Police rappelled down that embankment the following morning. The search took hours. Under 3 years of brush, trash, and seasonal snow dump, they found metal. A 1982 Ford Escort crushed flat against the trees at the bottom. The roof was caved in. The metal was rusted into the frozen earth, indistinguishable from the dirt until you were right on top of it. Inside the driver's seat sat what remained of a young man. The seasons had taken their toll. The summer heat and the winter freeze had done their work. There was no waxy skin or blue eyes left here. Just dry, leathered skin stretched tight over bone, grinning into the dark. But the clothes, synthetic and stubborn, had survived. A faded denim jacket, stained by the elements but intact. High-top sneakers laced tight around skeletal ankles. Bruce stood at the top of the ridge, watching them pull the body bag up. The breath left his lungs in a rush. He knew that jacket. He recognized those sneakers. A memory, 3 years old, clawed its way to the surface. He remembered a missing flyer that had hung in the break room for 6 months back in '91. The paper had curled at the corners before someone finally taped a pizza menu over it. "Leif," Bruce whispered. Leif Anderson. The stock boy who vanished the night of the Halloween blizzard. Forensics finally pieced together the physics of the nightmare. The loader driver, blinded by the whiteout in '91, had hit the small car while it sat on a patch of black ice near the edge. Because of the extreme cold, the tires didn't grip. The car didn't crunch. It didn't make a sound. It just slid. To the driver of the massive loader, it felt like pushing a heavy drift of snow over the ridge. And then the final horror hit Bruce. He thought back to that night in '91, standing at the window with his coffee. He remembered watching the loader push that massive pile over the edge. He remembered nodding to himself. He hadn't been watching snowfall. He had been watching Leif being buried alive. Leif had likely been sleeping with the heater running, waiting out the storm. He stayed in that ravine for 3 years. A ghost in the machine. A frozen secret buried in the woods. Bruce realized the boy hadn't been stalking him to kill him. The footprints, the staring, the pointing. It wasn't a hunt. Leif had been waiting in the cold for 3 long years for the only person who was there that night to finally look down.